Welcome, my name is Heather McClenahan. I'm the Executive Director of the Los Alamos Historical Society, and it is wonderful to have you all here tonight as we continue our lecture series, 100 Years on the Pajarito Plateau. We are in for, I think, a real treat tonight to learn about the history of fire on the plateau, and it's much more complicated than we might think. And now, for this evening, we are privileged to have with us another fabulous speaker. Craig Allen is a research ecologist with the United States Geological Survey, the Fort Collins Science Center, actually. He never goes to Fort Collins, but that's where his real office is. He is the station leader of the New Mexico Landscapes Field Station, which is based here at Bandolier National Monument. And he has worked here as a place-based ecologist since 1986. Craig received his PhD in forest and landscape ecology from the University of California, Berkeley in 1989. He has been conducting research here since 1986 on the ecology and environmental history of southwestern landscapes, the responses of western mountain ecosystems and forests globally to climate change. He is a core principal investigator of the USGS Western Mountain Initiative and an integration of research programs that studies global change in mountain ecosystems across the western United States, but with extensive international collaborations. Recent and ongoing research activities include, this is great stuff, integrated understanding of climate-induced tree mortality and forest die-off, including determination of global patterns and trends, development of ecological and fire histories in the southwest of the United States, ecological effects of recent fires on southwestern landscapes, ecological restoration of southwestern forests and woodlands, and developing long-term ecological monitoring networks across the landscape gradients in the Jemez Mountains. In addition, he served from 2001 to 2003 as the acting preserve scientist at the then brand new Valles Caldera National Preserve, where he initiated diverse long-term ecological inventory, monitoring, and research efforts. So you know, after all of this, the guy really knows his stuff. And without further ado, I will turn the microphone over to him.
Heather, I had no idea you were going to read that. I mean, and everybody's still here. You didn't get up and walk out already. So yeah, thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to be here. I used to give talks. Are you here? Not here. Sorry. Maybe this will work better. If I stand closer to it, you hear it? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I lived in either Bandolier or Los Alamos from '86 through 2009. I've been living in Santa Fe the last number of years, but I don't get up here as much, and my work has pulled me away a lot of the time. I haven't been around as much as I used to be. I'm less place-based, but I'm trying to circle back. And it's a great pleasure. Anyway, it's a pleasure to come back. And so some of you heard earlier versions of these stories 20 years ago. So anyway, so yes, so thank you, Heather, and the Historical Society for this invitation. So, probably everybody in this room knows where we are, but we're here, the south end of the Rockies in the Hamish Mountains, and it's been, I've actually been working here continuously since the summer of '82. I was still a graduate student. I did both my master's and PhD here in the Jemez studying landscape change, and have since '86 been based out of Bandolier. Science management partnerships has been a big part of what this work is about, and forests are a big part of the work. And especially in the last 15 or so years, when we've been seeing so much effect to our forests from various kinds of disturbances related to both human histories and climate. And so we'll tell you a few of these stories, and have lots of them I could tell, and we'll see. We'll run till we run out of time. So we won't belabor too much the Jemez. This slide is a nice elevational block diagram that Dorothy Lord drew for the first version of their Fox and Horde guidebook. And that's a prompt for me to remember. I didn't have a good picture, it turned out, of Dorothy, nor could I find one of Terry. I have most of my stuff in slides, but I need to thank many people through the years, including Dorothy at the very beginning in the early '80s, '82, turned me on to some of the local history and things like the existence of the 1935 air photos. Terry, of course, started a lot of work on forests and fire in this part of the world. And then some key people that I've worked with through the years, Kay Bealey, who's been sort of right-hand person for me since 1992 at Bandolier, and John Hogan and Rebecca Ortel, also in particular, both folks many of you may know in town here. So a little bit of somewhat deeper time history, going back about 15,000 years. So these sites here in the southern Rockies, each one of these triangles represents either a lake or a bog that was Scott Anderson, professor at Northern Arizona University, and his students in the late 90s and early 2000s, we sampled for pollen and charcoal to get multi-thousand-year records. And these two sites in the Jemez, we also did tree ring-based fire histories, which I'll talk more about those later in the talk. But for the moment, I'm going to talk about the deep time, at least the 15,000 years. Here's those two sites, Chihuahueños Bog on the Coyote District, and Alamo Bog inside the preserve, just off of, this is Redondo, so just off the northwest side of Redondo. So here's what Alamo Bog looks like, standing on the ground. And we took a 5 meter, that's centimeters, 500 centimeter core, several of them actually out of this bog that go back almost 10,000 years, 9,000 years. And so here we tried it a couple different ways, we kept thinking we could break through the 10,000 year barrier, but turns out there seems to be no sediment. It's just rock cobbles at the bottom of that. There's Scott and a graduate student, Renata Juniper, who did that work. And here's Chihuahueños Bog, the one on the north side. This one, we got a similar depth out of it, but it went back about 15,000 years at Chihuahueños. So here's the charcoal record at Chihuahueños, down to 4 meters. There's almost 14,000 calendar years before present. Here's the top of the core. There's the last 120 years. The cores get compressed toward the bottom, the weight, so there's more time per centimeter of depth deeper through the core. Main point here, from about the last 9,000 years on, immense amounts of charcoal per centimeter. This is in thousands of, that's 5,000 particles per cc. So, I mean, this is astronomical for this kind of work. These kinds of, probably the surface of the bog itself burned in dry years, when it was probably just burning literally like a grass fire over these bogs. But the one big anomaly in the last 9,000 years is the top of the core, no charcoal. And this big increase, and this is back into the last glacial period. The last glacial ended about here. So there was a transition to vegetation. The modern monsoonal climate set up about 9,000 years ago. So basically, for the last 9,000 or so years, the modern climate vegetation patterns at a gross level we see on the landscape have been present here. This is going back, again, this is thousands of years before present, so that's 14,000 before present. Here was the end of the last ice age. So the end of the last ice age, we had tundra, steppe converting into spruce and actually sagebrush, kind of a parkland right at the end of the last glacial. And then as it warmed up, we turned into mixed conifer forests that had some gamble oak. There was a period from about 6,500 to 8,500 years before present where the bog dried up. So we see this so-called altithermal, this warmer period, is widespread in parts of the West in these kind of records. And then we got the mixed conifer forest that surrounds that site today through the present. But this is the point right about here, and in going into that warm dry period where the modern charcoal concentration, the high frequency fire regime sets up. Don't even look at this. Don't look at this closely, but this is a paper that came out a half dozen years ago in Nature that was a joint effort. Here in the Valle Grande, we took an 88 meter core with a scientific drilling rig. That was a joint effort with USGS, the lab, and many universities. Peter Fawcett of UNM was the lead author on this. This is the only big paper that's come out of it yet. But that core record was from a lake that used to be in the Valle Grande. That was from the period from 360,000 years before present to about 552,000 years before present. It was a lake formed when this mountain, South Mountain, one of the last ones in the caldera erupted, and it blocked the exit of the East Fork of the Jemez, and this was a lake for, well, about 182,000 years. We got a record out of this thing. And there's a lot of detail here, but the point I want to tell you, the orange bars are the interglacial warm periods in that record, similar to the interglacial we're in now. This is the colder glacial, and you see the same thing. During the glacial, there was a lot of spruce, a lot of fir, a lot of sagebrush, cold climates. And during the warmer periods, you see more oak and more pine. So this kind of a pattern's been going on for a long time, and more fire, more charcoal, okay? Details could be looked at if you want, but just wanted to tell you, we do actually, it's one of the few records in the West that goes back that far. What do tree rings tell us? So now we're going to come forward in time and look at what we can say for the last hundreds to a couple thousand years with tree rings. And we can say a lot. There's been a ton of work. And this is work I've been deeply involved with for several decades now. This paper is a good place to lay some context for that. And the title tells the gist of the story. Temperature is a potent driver of regional forest drought stress and tree mortality. And Park Williams, who was postdocing at the lab here a few years ago, was the lead author on this paper. And using wood from actually all across the region, but we can go more than 2,000 years in New Mexico with old wood laying on rocky places where it didn't decay nor burn up. And Park took all of the, he's at Columbia University at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory right now, and he's a rising star doing many cool things. And this was sort of his real breakout paper. So he took it emerged out of his dissertation work. All of these are places where there's a chronology of 10 to 20 trees. He took all the available tree growth data in this big tree ring database and looked at it all together for signals of climate to predict tree growth. And this is, for just the last 100 years, this is the tree growth pattern. And I show this because we're going to see this graphic a little bit. So here's 1900. Here's 2000, and so when it's below this line, which is the mean line, standardized, and this is hundreds of thousands of tree rings, okay, measured, precisely measured, and then being analyzed statistically. So right around 1900, there was a dry period. Below the line is poor growth, dry. Above the line is good growth. So the early 1900s, there's the 50s drought. Here's the wet period of the later 1900s. And here's the drought through 2007 that we were in. It continues, actually. We're still bouncing around down here. So that's the actual tree growth. It turns out that what Park uncovered is that this tree growth is a function not only of winter-spring precipitation. So to predict the growth for next summer, once we know how much winter and spring precip we get, that gives you about half the strength of the tree growth pattern. But it turns out that the temperature during the growing season also affects tree growth. And this had not actually been found previously, except for tree line, high elevation things where we knew that that's what limits tree growth at the top. But this is in the heart of the distribution. And basically when it's hotter, trees grow more poorly. Okay, which may seem counterintuitive to some folks, but basically it's amplifying the drought stress. And when you combine precip and this is another way of expressing the temperature. It's the moisture deficit of the atmosphere, vapor pressure deficit. But we don't need to go into the details of that. The bottom line is that this, excuse me, I need to go back, that this gives, for those of you that know anything about statistics, correlation coefficients of R values of 0.91 and 0.82. This is the strongest climate predictor of tree growth that's ever been developed. But it applies at the scale of those two states, Arizona and New Mexico, the Southwest. But it's a super strong predictor of tree growth, and it lets us go forward and back in time because of that. So here's a 1,000-year perspective on tree growth in the Southwest. And many of these tree ring chronologies came out of the Jemez. There's been a lot of work here. So there's 81,000, here's 2,000. This ends at 2007. The gray are the annual years, the individual growth years, and this is a 10-year smoothing put through it. And so what you see is that variability is quite normal. Again, above the line is good growth, below the line is poor growth. Oops, wrong way, sorry. So there are some of the really severe known mega droughts in the past 1,000 years that have been known. This is the late 1200s that forced the Puebloan, ancestral Puebloan people out of the Four Corners, the Mesa Verde area, many of whom ended up here in the Tewa Basin, Espanola Valley. excuse me. This is the late 1500s mega drought, thought to be the worst drought in the last millennium, until perhaps the one we're in now currently, which has continued to actually deepen since the date ended in 2007. This level, a bit arbitrary when you get to, and this, by the way, this predictor index, you could call it as either tree growth, but this two variable predictor, winter precip and summer growing season, part called Forest Drought Stress Index, or FDSI. So you'll see, that's what this label says, is Forest Drought Stress Index. Some places will see it FDSI. When you get to a negative value, about minus 1.5, we know that trees were dying from drought stress in these last two droughts. Here's the 1950s drought. Okay, so that's a, you know, if you get to that level, that's dry enough that it kills some trees. And then here, circled, this is an individual year. That's 2002. And if you scan across, you'll see there's nothing even close to that. So objectively, 2002 was the worst year for tree growth in the last 1,000 years. The trees are telling us that. And we don't think it's because it was drier than every year. I mean, look at this, the late 1500s, there are no good years in the late 1580s. It's just dry, and it stayed dry down there. But it's the warming. The warming is causing an amplification of the drought stress. And there's detail to that, because with warming temperatures, you get a nonlinear increase in the drying of the atmosphere. It's just the physics of that at equilibrium, the atmosphere can hold more water when it's warmer. And that relationship is nonlinear, so it's an exponential increase in the drying of the atmosphere with warming of the temperature. And that is starting to have big effects on many things in nature, including tree growth. So, and we've seen that. We've seen that locally here. Those of you, many of you, have been here for a number of years, and you've seen that transition from the wet period to the dry period. And so we get these big fires and tree die-off events. We'll talk about fire second. We're going to talk a little bit about the die-off events. This is not a new thing. As I mentioned, here's the 1950s drought. This is the Mesa south of Frijoles Canyon is here. And this is low elevation to high elevation. This is PJ woodland in yellow. This is ponderosa pine in green. And the red is the dieback of the ponderosa pine forest at the lower fringes between 1954 and 1958. I mapped it off of air photos. We also dated it with tree rings from the dead logs and snags on the landscape. And it was documented by people at the time. And so anyway, the lower fringes of the ponderosa pine zone died back in the 1950s, just like they've been doing recently. Here is a newspaper article from 1957, Sunday newspaper headline written by Tony Hillerman, who, before he was a world-famous author, was a reporter for the New Mexican. And this is a headline that could have been any time in the last 17 years, right? Since the early 2000s. Forest threatened by beetle invasion. 2 species of bark beetles stripping northern New Mexico of its Pinyon and ponderosa pine. Approximately 1 million acres are currently dead or dying. From Santa Fe to Taos, south to Albuquerque, Vegas, in the Jemez around Los Alamos, etc. You could have, that whole thing could have been just recycled here in the early 2000s. And indeed, this is what it looked like. This is San Luis Mesa, the Y intersection down here, so the main hill road to Los Alamos is going up there. And this is fall of 2002, and all those orange trees are Pinyon dying. And there's what it looked like 18 months later when the needles came off. All right, that's the same tree, that little red dot there. Okay, so it's kind of a big deal, and we know that, people who lived here. And, you know, on the ground, it did that in places where Pinyon was the dominant. But it wasn't just Pinyon. People live in the Pinyon juniper woodland zone and a bit up into the ponderosa zone, but it was, junipers have died. In that episode in the early 2000s, ponderosa pine. These are white fir and Douglas fir up in the Valles Caldera, all in that period from 02 to 04. Just all along the elevation gradient, and shrubs and grasses. 2/3 of the dominant grass cover in the woodlands of Bandolier, Blue Grama, died back in 02, 03 from long-term data that we have measuring the grasses. So the beetles got the press, but what was driving it was the drought, in particular the warmer drought. Anyway, at the level of Arizona and New Mexico, this is from 97 to 2012, the areas affected by bark beetle, drought stress, tree killing. This is the area of crown fire through 2012. And there, when you put the two of them together, it was about 20% of the forest area of the region. was affected in that 18-year window. So it's a significant issue going on regionally. Okay, and of course here's where we are in New Mexico. That's the Las Conchas footprint there primarily. But we're down here now. This is west-wide. This is British Columbia. This is looking through the lens of bark beetle outbreaks, killing tree agents west-wide. These are all, this is forest entomologists, bark beetle people. So they're looking in as, oh, this is a big insect thing going on in the west. Yeah, drought and heat are involved, but it's the insects doing the work. The blue is the Pinyon ips that took out the Pinyon in the Great Basin and here in the Four Corners area. Here's where we are. The big mortality on the Pajarito Plateau didn't even get mapped because they didn't start mapping it until the year after it happened because they didn't expect it. All these different colors are different tree species and different bark beetles. So this is a huge thing that's going on west-wide. This thing in British Columbia is mountain pine beetle in lodgepole pine. Biggest, I mean, that's like 30 million acres, okay, through 2010. It's still ongoing. This is what's going on in California. 20% of the trees in California are dead or dying in the last 2.5 years. So this is the southern Sierra Nevada. And it turns out this is something going on globally. And this is the thing that's actually pulled me away from this part of the world in the last 15 years, because it turned out that these episodes of drought and heat stress, hotter drought, killing trees, and amplifying fire, but this particular set of events not been well documented globally, but it turns out when you start poking around, it's been going on all over the place. And so I've been working with people trying to better understand this phenomenon and better understand how much risk are the world's forests at. Because even if precip doesn't change the warming temperatures, we just very briefly touched on, the warming temperatures are, trees can't move, like birds can, to keep up with the changing distribution of the climate. The forest drought stress is going up. During extreme droughts, trees are starting to die in unusual ways all around the planet. So, and this was 20 co-authors around the world. We put this together half dozen or so years ago. So, now we're going to go back in time through the beauty of tree rings and talk a little bit about a historical story and involved people. We're going to look at this mesa just south of headquarters in Bandolier, just south of the canyon on the mesa top. There's a little arc site called Frijolito, and it's on this mesa top there, and it's in the woodland zone. And in 1993, with a colleague at Los Alamos, a guy named Brad Wilcox, a hydrologist studying runoff and erosion processes, he had a site at, what was it, TA51, I guess, is where they're, in the heart of the lab anyway, the site, and he was looking for a site off the lab to set up as a comparison. So I said, yeah, we got these runoff and erosion issues, let's do this. So we set up this 1 hectare watershed to study runoff and erosion processes, but being an ecologist, I'm also interested in what's going on with the interactions, the ecohydrology between vegetation and the runoff and erosion. And so we tried to reconstruct the history. We did many things in this watershed. This is the basic setup for runoff and erosion stuff. But on the ground, one of the things you see were all these ponderosa pine logs that probably died in the 50s drought. And we decided, well, we cored every, there were 100 ponderosa pine logs, but no live ponderosa pine in that watershed at the time. Said, oh, this used to look different. Maybe this runoff and erosion processes used to be different in the past too, and the vegetation has something to do with it. So let's try to reconstruct it. We know these soils are really old on these mesa tops in the heart of the plateau. They basically formed during the last ice age. They have this clay-rich B horizon, which takes a long time to form. So the soil erosion seems like it's an unusual recent historical event. And then there's people in the system. This is Taos Pueblo, but in Bandolier, there's more than 3,000 arc sites been documented and mapped. And in the woodland zone, 90% of them are eroding to one degree or another. And so this was something that the Park Service was interested in, and is part of why I was doing this work at the time. Well, so here, and because there's been a lot of archaeology done in Bandolier, we can show you maps of human settlement through time. So I'm going to show you a couple of those for the mesa top centered around our little Frijolito watershed. And the arc site of Frijolito is going to show up here a little bit later. But so here's 1,200, and these are different kinds. These are small pueblos that existed in 80, 1,200. And this is the visitor center sitting right down here, right? This is Frijoles Canyon. There's the creek. So, so this is just the Mesa to the south. So here's this little watershed that's the focus of our attention. And you can see there were people in 1200 living all around here. By 1350, there's even more of these little pueblos. These are 6 to 99 room pueblos. And then here by 1500, there's quite a few more, and these red ones are 100 or more rooms. So these are communal pueblos. So this is the Frijolito site that I'm sure many of you have hiked to and seen. This is Joni down in the canyon bottom, and this is the Cave 8 villages along the, no, actually that probably must be, this is Rainbow House, that must be Joni. Anyway, a lot of people living here. So from Bandolier, the archaeologists estimate from the late 1200s through 1550, the population of Bandolier was somewhere between 1,000 and 2,500 people throughout that time. Living there year-round, all the time. And one of the things they're doing is they're using wood. And they move off in the late 1500s. The landscape, these people all moved north of this canyon. They moved there, they were Tewa people that moved down to San Ildefonso. And south of Frijoles Canyon, they were Carrie speakers, and they moved to ancestral Cochiti and pueblos to the south. Anyway, they abandoned the plateau for reasons of their own in the late 1500s, right before the Spanish settlement. And one of those reasons may very well be that they had deforested the mesa tops. And we have some evidence of that. So we're going to look at this right here as we zoom in to this little watershed. Every piece of scrap of dead wood there, working with this dendroecologist, Peter Brown. Some of these trees we sampled 6 times trying to get both the birth date and the death date of that tree. So trying to get the outer ring and the inner ring. We were very persistent because it was just 1 hectare. And when you put it together, these are the timelines of the individual trees of the deadwood. We had also cored all the live pinyon in that watershed, which you can date with tree rings, in the 90s. And counted how many seedlings and saplings and estimated their age. So this is the deadwood, the old deadwood, and this is 1600 to 1950. And all that dead wood, and what you see is almost none of that dead wood got through the 1950s drought. So this is the death dates. The ponderosa pine had been dropping out, and a lot of the outside pieces of wood are missing, so we don't know the true death date unless it's got a little vertical tick mark line. If you can see that, that means there was a bark date. But anyway, the 50s drought finished off the ponderosa pine, which we already knew from this part of the world, but this confirmed it very precisely for this particular place. But it was also killing pinyon trees, which we also knew in this part of the world. So, and we have, and the oldest tree, by the way, going back here, there were 2 trees that established in the 1590s. Nothing, at the time the Pueblans were there are no trees, essentially, that go back between 1600 in this place. Even though these trees can live 600 or 700 years. If you go to Mesa Verde, these same 2 species of pinyon and juniper are 700 and 800 years old, which date to right after the ancestral Pueblans abandoned that area in 1280 due to that big drought. Okay? Again, it's thought they deforested that area. Well, it seems that there were no trees growing on this mesa top there. There were probably a few on the cliffs. So I'm going to show you the pattern of tree establishment over the next, for 400 years, starting in 1600, with those first 2 pine trees that established in the 1590s. And the different colors, ponderosa pine are green squares, pinyon are orange dots, and junipers are green triangles, light green triangles. So, a few ponderosa pine established. Now we're 1700, there's a few more ponderosa pine, and there's a rocky area up here and a rocky area down here that have a couple pinyons and junipers in them. And by 1750, that pattern is continuing. And by 1800, we see it very clearly. Most of the watershed's dominated by ponderosa pine, with this rocky area at the bottom where fire couldn't spread, because it wasn't grassy enough, apparently. But through here, there's fire scars on the interiors of a lot of these old ponderosa pine. And when a tree dies, by the way, it turns into a log. And we map it. We don't know when it fell, but we map it where it is today. So you start seeing logs starting to show up. Now by 1850, the fires are just stopping now, and pinyons and junipers are starting to emerge in the understory. But this has still been a ponderosa pine-dominated hill slope up to this point. By 1880, there's definitely no fire. Pinyons and junipers are rapidly increasing. By 1944, That date was a little arbitrary, but it was the beginning of the 50s drought. So I just picked a year right at the beginning of the 50s drought. And you see that there's now huge numbers of pinyons and junipers. This hill slope's dominated by pinyons and junipers, but there's still live ponderosa pine here. But by 1960, after the 50s drought, every ponderosa pine's dead. So this has gone from ponderosa pine grass, the ponderosa pine, the grass being grazed away by sheep, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then the ponderosas all die, and it's now pinyons and juniper in 1960, which just keep getting denser through 2000. And then in 2007, all those orange dots turn white. All the pinyon died. Every mature pinyon died in that watershed. So, huge transformations in 4 centuries. People think of landscapes as stable and static, but there's big things that go on, and it's a combination of human land use, decisions ranging from deforestation to fire suppression, and climate variability. That one piece of hill slope in the last 400 years has existed in all of these conditions. So, anyway, this, again, overwhelming. This is a paper you could look up to read the details, but here, this was published a year ago. This is a similar story, but on a much broader spatial scale in the southwest corner of the Jemez, in the ancestral Jemez homelands of the Mesas. So this is the Jemez River Valley. This is the southwest corner of the Valles Caldera. Okay? So the Valle Grande, East Fork of the Jemez, comes together. So this is the Jemez Valley. And these are these huge, there are, what, a dozen pueblos of 1,000 or more rooms within, I don't know, like an 8-mile radius of Jemez Springs. So huge population density, and they were in the ponderosa pine zone, so we can do fire histories there. Anyway, they put together a similar story about how did people live in these pinyon juniper woodlands and ponderosa pine stories, and it appears they largely deforested the areas close to these settlement areas by the time of into the early 1600s. So, and who did that? Well, this guy, Tom Swetnam, who until 2.5 years ago was the director of the tree ring lab at the University of Arizona, has been a close colleague friend of mine since the mid-'80s. And one of his students, Ellis Margolis, who now works with me, running out of our field station. We have an office in the state office of BLM on the south side of Santa Fe, and Ellis has set up a little tree ring lab there. So Ellis is the future of the field station moving forward. But it's a great pleasure to have him here, and I'm going to show you some of the recent new, and Tom, by the way, went to high school and middle school in Jemez Springs, and he's retired there. And when I agreed to do this talk, I don't know, about 8 months ago, if there was some possibility I might not be here, Tom was the guy who would have been given the talk if I didn't do this. But either of these guys could have done a great job. So this is 2.5 years ago when when we got Ellis working for us, hired him. This is the Hamish Mountains. This is a hexagonal grid that Ellis has laid on top of the mountain range to determine areas to sample. And these different colored dots are places that, since I've been here in the late 80s, we've been sampling tree rings opportunistically for different projects. So this is a big project in the Valles Caldera and Brown. This was stuff out of my dissertation work in the 80s, late 80s, 87, that sampling. Other areas, here's a cluster. Here's in the Los Alamos town site. Here's Los Alamos town site. This is up in Pajarito, Campme, and Cañada Bonito mountain area. Anyway, this is what it looked like 2.5 years ago. And all these red places, Ellis has added between 12 and 30 trees at each of these dots, trying to fill out the grid. Because our goal is to, he's still dating some of this wood. It's not all dated yet. So far, they got about 1,400 trees and 9,300 scars dated. But it'll be over 10,000 scars by the end of the winter, because that wood's been sampled and they're just finishing dating it. But we're going to be able to look at the spatial pattern of fire across this landscape. And I'm going to show you that, what we've got so far. There's holes in it, but those holes are going to get filled as this wood gets dated. So we're going to see this. The earliest tree ring date is, well, the earliest fire scar date we have for the mountain range is 1125 AD, which came out of that sample area right there. So, and I have, by the way, some pieces of wood here and here if you want to look later what these kind of samples look like. And this is a basic fire scar chronology that you use to generate this wood. So each one of these horizontal lines is the timeline of an individual sample. Right? Individual piece of wood like this. Right? And So there's the center of the tree, and there's fire scars on it. You date each ring through the precise methods of dendrochronology. And for 60–70% of the fire scars, you can even get a season that prehistoric fire burned by the relative, where the fire scar intersects within the annual growth rate. Okay? And so we're going to see seasonality of fire going back 400 years here in the maps I'm going to show you in just a moment. But anyway, so this is a fire history that I collected in 1996, just on the upper edge of the Camazon Estates at the base of the pipeline road. And so these are all these trees. And so this is the horizontal timeline of individual trees. It's almost all dead wood. So that's why the dates end before. This was probably a live tree. So that was probably the one live tree that we collected up there, 96. And the vertical tick marks are a fire scar. And so a key feature you see of this is that there's this synchrony between trees. These are all scarring in the same year. And what you see is in that area, at the upper west edge of Los Alamos, there were 11 or 12 fires in the 1800s. And that fire was the last spreading surface fire. Again, these trees are recording, you know, up to 15 fires on a single tree. These are surface fires, not killing these trees. Okay, I mean, probably you all know this. But 1883 was the end of it at Los Alamos. So to the Cerro Grande fire in 2000, that was 117 years of fuel buildup instead of 8 or 9 or 10 years between each of those intervals previously. That's why we got a different kind of a fire from that and the other big fires we've been seeing in the Jemez and elsewhere in the Southwest. So, the kind of fire history I'm talking about here are these surface fires, okay, burning in fuels that look like this, and they actually were essential to the ecology of those systems and maintained them from overshooting and becoming too dense. And there were many plants and animals whose life cycles are tuned to that. However, and this is an image of the Las Conchas, or Cerro Grande burning here above town in Ponderosa Pine, but crown fire is natural in the higher spruce fir forests in this part of the world. And Ellis, actually, the new tree ring guy working with us, he started in the late 90s. I supported both his master's and PhD, reconstructing crown fires with tree rings. And you look for big aspen stands, and so anyway, he's done that work, including some sites in the Jemez. And what you see are the big stand replacing fires are a subset of the surface fire years. So they're the extra dry years in the surface fire chronologies prior to 1900. But anyway, and this, oh, by the way, so now a couple little anecdotes about Aspen, which are tied to these high severity fires. So we sampled a bunch of aspen stands here above Los Alamos in that Camp May, Cañada Bonito area. This is the north side of Camp May a few years ago. And some of these big old trees sticking up here, surprisingly, we had in a tree that died in 1992, established in 1714. So it was 278 years old when we sampled it. And there were some living trees of that same size class there. So if any of this would be just on the north side of the Cañada Bonito mountain, the north side of that grassland in the old spruce fir forest. So I need to go up there and look, but if there's any of these trees still alive, they'd be a little more than 300 years old. Most people didn't think aspen could live that long, but they can. This is the biggest single aspen stand I know of, pre-1900 in the Jemez, in Upper Camazon Canyon. And Quemar, to burn, Camazon, burnt. A little bit ironic, actually, thinking about one of my close colleague friends had a house that they built in Camazon Estates right before the Cerro Grande fire. That his was one that made it on the west edge. But anyway, it was presumably, that fire is 1893, which is the last fire that burned up on that slope, the last of the spreading fires. But on these north wet-facing slopes, you could get patches of aspen burning out, but this was a big one, okay, for the Jemez. In the Sangre de Cristos, you see patches like that that are big. But when this was homesteaded in the late 1800s and the 1880s and 1890s, they probably called this Camazon Canyon, right? Because this fire happened and there was this big burn scar up there. And so a little bit of an interaction. So aspen and elk. So this is a little side story about elk. So elk were native to northern New Mexico and to the Jemez. They were a Rocky Mountain species, not the Gila subspecies. But They were reintroduced early in the 1900s statewide. This is population, that's a logarithmic population curve. So that's 10,000. So this is statewide. This is Hamish Mountains, and this was estimates of Bandolier. And this was a little thing I did in, I don't know, 1994, I guess. Data through there. But elk were reintroduced to the Hamish in the 40s. Okay, and their population started to grow, but it really took off after the La Mesa fire, which created the right kind of habitat in the winter for these elk. Okay, which, like grass, but in late fall, in late winter and early spring, they eat a lot of woody plants, are actually more nutritious. And so here is in the winter of 2000, 2001, we actually got a little bit of snow that winter, pushed them out of the center. This is Bandolier, and this is where the La Mesa fire grassland patches from 77 were. And these are elk, radio telemetered elk, and this is where the elk were hanging out, right in the middle of the barnyard. So for a while, Bandolier had the primo elk habitat in the Jemez for about 15 or so years. And then Cerro Grande happened, and now we got elk habitat all over the east side. But elk, interesting, but their population was just starting to boom in the Jemez when I started working here full-time full-time in at least the summers, in the summer of '82. So this is me, this is on near Polvadera Peak in the northeast corner. And this aspen, which you see this now, the aspen are all beat up, the old ones all over the Jemez, but this was brand new, fresh in '82. The elk population was just, we could actually date when the elk population expanded by dating the scars of the elk gnawing on the aspen, if we wanted to. We don't need to do that. But they've been a little hard on the aspen. However, these most recent fires are so big. There's concern in a lot of places in the West. When fires are little, the aspen resprouts and the elk chew them down. This is the fence line of an exclosure, and outside there's no aspen, inside there is, but these most recent fires, Las Conchas in particular, there's so much aspen regeneration that even with a big elk population, it's escaping it and doing fine. However, on the Valles Caldera, there's a small population of this little birch tree in Alamo Bog, actually. On the edges, we found it when we sampled that bog in '96. And here's the edge of the bog. And this is what they look like if they grew up, but when we were there in '96, they all looked like this. We said, what is that plant? And it's Bog Birch, which across the boreal zone of Canada, there's bazillions of them. But in New Mexico, this is the only known population. It's a relic of glacial time, sitting here in this little cold, wet, acidic bog, hanging on, and the elk had just about wiped them out. They were all down. That's oh, you can't see, my finger's off the field of view. That thing is barely shin high and all beat up. But they've fenced these couple little populations, and they're growing up, you know, with the elk not chewing them down, and so it'll probably survive for a while. But anyway, it's a cool thing. But you know, you think about these kinds of, again, the history. Elk were here, but we're here in low abundance. Probably were kept low by large numbers of ancestral Puebloan people, because the elk had to come down to the mesas in the snowy winters of that time period, and the Puebloans ate them. Anyway, the persistence of that plant was another 20 years, those plants would have been gone, and with the current elk population, telling us that probably the current elk population is a lot higher than it was for a long time. Anyway, now we're going to go through, here's the year 1684. This is, the dark colors are low elevation, maybe a little counterintuitive, but this is an elevation, a shaded elevation model of the Jemez. So you see the central caldera. Here's where the Jemez River drains out. Here's the Valle Grande. There's Redondo. Chacoma's up here. Here's Frijoles Canyon. And here's Los Alamos. These are those fire scar samples in Los Alamos. And these are going to show you, the white X's are trees that were recorders in that year, meaning they already had a fire scar on them previously, so they were susceptible to being scarred again. And then the colored dots are a tree that's scarred in that year, and the colors, we're not going to talk about the colors, but these colors represent different seasons that the fire burned, inferred from that relative position of the scar in the tree. So you don't need to pay too much attention to the colors now, but just note how big of an area was burned in the year 1684. Well, there was another fire, or a set of fires. We don't know how many fires this actually represents, how many starts. There's 1685, the very next year, which is even bigger portion of the mountain range. Right? There's 1684. this one, but it burned much of the same area that 1685, okay? But again, remember, I just want to emphasize, this kind of method is reconstructing this kind of fire, surface fires, okay? High-frequency surface fires burning in surface fields. So there's 1685, and I'm just going to go through quickly a bunch of these up to 1899 to give you a sense of, people think that, oh, the Las Conchas fire or the Cerro Grande was the biggest fire in the history of New Mexico. Well, I don't know, how big would you, the Jemez is about 1 million acres, okay? Cerro Grande was 43,000. It was big for the time, but it was not even close to big. Every one of these I'm going to show you is bigger than that, okay? There's 1685, there's 1730, well, this is a small one. I wanted to show this one's kind of unusual because it had, these blue dots are a fall fire. Very unusual, almost all the fires here. What we do know from these fire scars is that spring and early summer was the time that the fires were burning prehistorically, just like they do today. But this was an unusual one. This was a fall fire. There's probably something historical, maybe human involved in this. 1737, if somebody's got a good idea, we'd like to hear it about what might have been going on in Frijoles, Upper Frijoles Canyon area in 1737. There's 1748. That was the biggest fire year in western North America and in the southwest. And it burned almost most of the mountain range. But here in the northeast quadrant, we don't have a lot of samples yet, but not so much. But 4 years later, I mean, right? 1748, most of the mountain range burns, and 4 years later, half the mountain range, or 2/3 of it burns. So, but again, surface fire. There's 1801, pretty much, but not so much in the center of the caldera that year. But 1842 did. 47, 5 years later. 51. And again, so just I want to point out, these are Los Alamos dots. This is the Pipeline Road site, and this is a site in the heart of, it's in Pueblo Canyon between the two bridges, okay, in the walking area, sort of down below where the walking trails are. There's 1861, 1870, 1879, and here's 1883, and I show this because this was the last spreading fire in Los Alamos area. So here are those two sites in Los Alamos. There's the Camazon pipeline site, and this is the one in Pueblo Canyon. 1883, and that was the last spreading fire there. But in other parts of the Jemez for another 15 years, 16 years, so there's 93, and there's 99. That was the last really sort of widespread fire in the Jemez, and then it stopped. But yeah, there's the fire scar chronology from the Pueblo Canyon bench at the heart of the town site. 1883, that was the end of the story. Well, it turns out, why did they stop in the late 1800s? Actually, there was not a fire policy suppression in place at that time. There was debate about whether fire was actually a good or a bad thing. And it turns out you see that pattern all across the southwest US. These are chronologies from Arizona, New Mexico, and they stop with one exception in an area where there was not. Anyway, that's the heart of El Malpais. Sorry, wrong way. What happened was railroads reached the foot of the Jemez Mountains in 1880. Reached Espanola, coming down. The Chile line came down from Denver and Rio Grande, and also reached Santa Fe. 1879, 1880, Santa Fe and this area got connected. And within a decade, by the 1890 census, there were 5 million sheep and 2 million cattle and hundreds of thousands of horses and burros grazing in open range condition across New Mexico. And you guys know the history, land grants and all the things that went on. And the year-round grazing, and the animals ate the grassy fuels that carried the fire. And so we had accidental, inadvertent fire suppression as an accidental outcome of overgrazing on these landscapes, which also triggered all kinds of other processes, changes in vegetation, dominance, and runoff and erosion processes, arroyo downcutting, all this dating to the late 1800s. And these forests, this piece of wood, actually, I'm standing on the stump that this piece of wood came off of in 1987, and looking at all of these trees did not exist. 1899 was the last fire at this site, and this was 1987, and this is, instead of grassy fuels, this stump has about 15 fire scars on it, this piece of wood from here. that stopped in the 1800s, and all of this stuff grew up and thick, and it allows fire to get from the ground up into the canopies, and then fire starts to behave different. That happened not only at the scale of a stand, something like the size of this room or this building, but at the scale of the landscape. So I did my master's work in the early 80s looking at these high elevation grasslands that used to cover these south-facing slopes. Here's Cerro Grande. This was taken about 1990 from an airplane looking north. So here's Cerro Grande, Pajarito Mountain, Cañada Bonito south. There's Chicoma. The landscape filled in with trees horizontally, which meant that a crown fire could run across huge swaths of landscape, as we've seen. This is that tree invasion on Cerro Grande. It's about 1.5 miles across the field of view from the 1935 air photos to 1979. And this just kept filling in through that time period. So another historical human land use thing, really major effect on forests in the Jemez was logging and roads. So part of the dissertation work in the late 80s, I mapped over 250,000 acres, all the road networks off the 1935 air photos. So here's Los Alamos area today, and these were the road networks that existed then, everything. Off by 1981, it went to that. This is so and most of what this is logging. Okay, and we're going to zoom into a case study in the Valles Calderas, which the Valles Caldera National Preserve. This was a master's thesis project that the Caldera funded, that we solicited this from a young man, Jeff Balm at the University of Arizona. And so he used multiple lines of evidence. He used, to get the history of logging up there, he looked at logging records. The state had a lot of logging records. He looked at air photos. And there were some timber inventories. So this is the little bump on the north side of Redondito. And these are those rock rubble fields, those Felsenmeers, in 1963. There it is in 1975. Those roads were put in to cut all those trees. So this was when the owner, okay, the Dunnigans didn't own the timber rights. The timber rights had been separated. I don't know, like about 1918, and the New Mexico Timber Company was doing this really rather rapacious kind of cutting. And so, huge effects on the forest, obviously. So here's a time series based on multiple lines of evidence that Jeff put together. So here's the window 1935 to 1962, and these are all areas that were logged that you see in red in that window. There's 63 to 72, 80 to 91, 92 to 2000. 2000 is when the federal government acquired it and became a preserve and the logging stopped. And there it is, 35 to 2000, and the red are all the areas that have been logged to varying degrees. Not all clear cut like that stuff you saw. And this is actually a minimum estimate because there are parts of these that have been logged as well. So, and associated with that is the road network that was put in. So this is one of the issues that preserve has to deal with. Is this inherited this network of logging roads and in places you can, when I first came in the early 80s, you could see these obliquely looking across. As the forests had gotten thicker over the last 30 years, they started to not be as visible, but now with the big fires burning the cover off, you can see the spiral road networks again. This is a very common one if you go into the visitor center. Up Cerro Abrigo, you see that one in your face. So, I'm now going to go back to the tree ring story and the human land use story for the last 120 years and put the two together and talk about forest here in the Jemez. So here is that tree growth or that forest drought stress index, which we're calling it here FDSI, back to 1896, I think. So, and here, when we see orange bars like this are drought periods. So we're going to walk through this and we're going to look at wet-dry cycles and what else was going on at the same time. Well, here's when the surface fires stopped. When the overgrazing happened in the late 1800s and the surface fires that used to thin the small trees and keep the forests open enough, the pine forests, stopped by 1900 across the Jemez. Then we hit early in the 20th century, the teens and 20s were wet. 1910 is when fire suppression became a policy after a bad fire year in the northern Rockies. And here it's a little hard to see green arrow. There's 1919. The foresters at that time documented a remarkable pulse of tree regeneration in the Southwest. Just, you couldn't even walk. It was carpets of baby trees, and there's no longer surface fires to thin them out. So these trees are now, 1919, have been growing for almost a century. The 1950s drought shows up here. It put stress on forests. There was some risk. There was a little talk at dinner tonight. There was a fire in '54 that scared people at the lab. But people were able to keep a lid on it. And then there was this wet period from 78 to 95. And the forests, all of these baby trees have now grown up significantly and have thickened. And the forest, by the time we got to the early 90s, was probably as dense as a forest in this part of the world could ever be. Because it had missed almost a century of fire and had gone through 2 wet periods with tree establishment. And so it was probably at the maximum biomass and tree density that it could even exist at. And this is what we all thought was normal, living here in the 80s and 90s. Okay? And a lot of people moved here from places in the east where thicker forests are natural. And so they wanted to see that green stuff. But here's 96. Oops. And so starting in the winter of 95, 96, there was a near snowless winter, and we immediately, started to pop fires that we couldn't contain, that are now starting to be more than 10,000 acres, and have kept getting bigger since then. And then trees are also dying from drought and heat stress and insects, amplifying that. Oh, and this was my personal little timeline. From 1982, so I arrived sort of in the early mid part of that period when this is going on, and started a lot of long-term studies, and have now, basically what I've been doing for the last 35 years is documenting these changes in the landscape and trying to understand them and trying to connect them to what's going on in other places. So anyway, Los Alamos and the Jemez have been like a spectacular example, a whole series of many different case studies about the effects of drought and heat-related disturbance processes in the landscape. So we talked about some of the insect and drought and heat stress fatality, and now we're going to do fire a little bit. And we've had a lot of this, these extreme kind of fires. And these are all pictures I took. All you got to do is just be awake here, right? Get a camera when something starts happening, and there it goes. And, you know, of course, this town has suffered directly the effects. You know, Cerro Grande in particular, this is kind of an overnight, a month apart satellite view with the town site here. There's the golf course. You know, and that big run along the west side of town. Oops. Oh, yeah, and so of course, you know, 200 homes, 400 structures. A comment but one of the things, and just as a human history, is that, you know, it really mobilized Craig Martin, John Hogan, that volunteer task force really mobilized. A lot of you probably participated. Something like half the population of Los Alamos County participated in 2000 and 2001 in some sort of rehab activity associated with that fire. I didn't get a slide in here yet. I couldn't find a digital image in time, but my kids planted trees up right from the grade schools up in hill slopes, and the only place that there's ponderosa pine growing up there is where Craig Martin and John Hogan led people and planted them up there, basically. The trees, because the mother trees were eliminated from such a huge area. And so you can stand and look back now at that pattern where there aren't trees, and it's directly related to that. So I'm going to show you what the pattern of fire looks like on this landscape as a whole. So here's the Jemez, and these are land ownership boundaries, right? That's the Caldera, Bandolier, town site of Los Alamos, the lab, Forest Service. Oh, that's lightning strikes in 1996. So, by the way, even if there weren't humans in this landscape who've used fire for a long time, lightning is a huge source, and most of the ignitions that occur in this landscape are actually lightning. However, the one thing about human ignitions is they can occur on dry, cloudless, windy days when there isn't lightning. So you can get an ignition on the worst possible kind of fire weather day today. That's another thing that's a little different. But anyway, we have back to 1909 fire suppression records, and we've mapped them all. And so this actually, we haven't updated this computer mapping recently, but here's through 2012. So 7,100 fires, and the yellow ones are lightning ignitions, and the red ones are human ignitions. which kind of follow roads and campgrounds and places where people live. This is an underestimate, because look at the density of lightning conditions over Bandolier. With nothing over the lab? That's a reporting issue, one would believe, okay? Including in Forest Service land. I mean, there's no reason to believe lightning fires preferentially hit Bandolier. It's just there's a greater intensity of observation. So anyway, we're going to go decade by decade and look at the patterns of fire through the Jemez, the history of fire in the 20th century, of suppressed fires. So our first, these were hand-drawn atlases that we converted into digital maps. 1909 was the first record for the Santa Fe National Forest. There is, oh, I jump ahead. I don't even do it deck by decade because I got so many slides. So this is jumping all the way to 1989, and the different colors are different decades. The ones that are circles is where we had a size class and a point, but they didn't have a perimeter. So for 80 years, they put fires out with hand tools, and these are actually in the 1970s. Here's the La Mesa fire. There was a little window, 76, 77, 78. There was a pulse. I think these are 76, 77, 78. But amazingly successful fire suppression for most of the 20th century. And then we get to the 90s, and all right, we got the Dome fire, we got the Oso Complex fire. This is actually prescribed burn. This is that. But we're starting to get a little more nervous. And then oops, wrong direction. There's the 2000s. Now we're starting to pop more stuff. Here's Cerro Grande, the Lakes fire, some other stuff. There's 2010 to 2013, first 4 years of the 2010s. This is the Thompson Ridge fire, and of course Las Conchas and a number of other things. So even though we are now having DC-10s and 747s dropping slurry on these things, we can't keep these things in the box anymore. It's a combination of that land use history, the change in the fuel structure, and the change in the climate driver. I would just note, however, so people thought, oh, this is, but remember, we had the whole mountain range was burning in years like 1748 and many others in the past. And the forests weren't being destroyed by that. So as an ecologist, I care less about the perimeter. Actually, we need fire in these landscapes, but it's the amount of tree killing fire is the thing that I'm paying attention to. So let's look at that. So this is satellite interpretations of fire severity. And this is from 1996 to the present, the tree killing fire. We're missing some stuff in here, but these are the big wildfires. But you can see it's gutted the fires on the east flank of the Jemez. And that is an issue for the future of the forest in this part of the world, because these trees around here don't resprout from the roots. They need mother trees to survive close by. Well, Aspen does, but most of the conifers don't. And so here we're just going to look at those fire severity patterns through time. So there's the La Mesa fire. There's the Dome fire, 77 La Mesa, 96 Dome, 98 Oso Complex, 2000 Cerro Grande, 2002 or 3 Lakes fire, 2011 Las Conchas, 2013 Thompson Ridge. The brown stuff is, and some of the darker colors are tree killing fire. Okay, so, and there's what, it's a little hard to see the landscape that left. There's an image that has the La Mesa fire was already burned out in it, the tree color. And what is this, 1995? Yeah, so this is Google Earth, 1995 image, and there's 2013. Oh, that didn't do very right. There it is. So 95, 2013, and you can see the tree cover goes away. All that green goes away. I mean, we've lost huge fractions of our forest on this east side. Oh, this is just zooming into Los Alamos, seeing the same thing. So we don't need to belabor the point. So the last, and so here's a little story, the history, the what it might have been. What is it, you know, sort of the butterfly wing, right, in the Amazon, starting a storm that turns into a hurricane. Well, here is the start of, oops, this is the Las Conchas fire. That's the trigger of the Las Conchas fire. This is taken 2 months after the start. This tree snapped this power line on 1 p.m. on June 26, 2011, Sunday. This tree, which was rooted on a little private parcel in holding, a Forest Service land, and this power line, 2 lines, it's been restrung by August, and I was out here when this when we went here to sample this aspen to see if there was a cool tree ring story. Turns out it's not that cool, but sort of a circa 1920, and it had a little bit of hard rot, and the wind that afternoon blew it down, it snapped the line, and here's where the fire started, right here. And you can see, after a little bit of rain that summer, it had greened up, but the wind is blowing right towards this corner like this. It didn't even burn the tree that started the fire. But here's where it started. But within 50, 100 meters, it's in the canopies of the trees. And this was taken less than an hour later from the fire tower on Cerro Pelado, due south of the caldera, as the guy in the tower, Jeff Dubé, was evacuating. Those are on the order of 500-foot flame lengths. You don't normally see them because there's usually smoke obscuring it, but he caught this as he's bailing from the fire tower as he was told to do. And it burned in the first 14 hours by, there was an infrared flight at 3 a.m., so 14 hours after the 1 p.m. ignition. It had burned the same acreage, 42,000 acres, as the whole Cerro Grande. And almost all of it was tree-killing fire. These are all photos from that first day run, starting up in the dense forests at the upper end along the caldera rim, mixed conifer forests. That's upper Bland Canyon. There's Cochiti Canyon, the single most top to bottom burned over watershed. This is in the dome area, 2 fires, the combination of the 96 dome fire and the 2011 Las Conchas. This surprised us the way it burned in the dome fire footprint. We thought that the reduction of the fuels by the dome fire in 96 would have bought it more time than this, but it was such an extreme fire event. It proved not the case. This is down off the southwest corner of Bandolier in the Sanchez Canyon, just south of Capuline Canyon, Mesa, and it is the single most, there wasn't that much there before the fire. There was apparently a plume collapse. There's debate about this, about what actually happened there, but you couldn't even hardly imagine how fire could carry through there. So 4 years later, 5 growing seasons later, we're out here, this tipped over, this is that same thing. This is tumbleweed, that's what's out there. There was less this year, we've gone every year, we've got some transects in there, we're following the vegetative response. But so the big question though, is what comes next? These are off the scale. Probably in the last 6,000 to 9,000 years, we haven't seen this kind of fire in these landscapes, at least not on that spatial scale. It's favoring things that resprout. This was taken a week after the Las Conchas fire burned through. There's St. Peter's Dome, so the dome lookout is there. And so you can see these snags here that survived the dome fire. This is all Gamble Oak and New Mexico locust that come back in 2 years, and it's all sprouted there. This is being taken over by shrubs. Things that resprout are being favored by this new kind of fire dynamic and also by the drought and heat stress dieback dynamics. Both of those things favor plants that can resprout. And indeed, we've done some work here recently. This was just published this fall. Ellis, again, a tree ring, Tom Sweatman's last PhD student at the tree ring lab, and others. This is in the Jemez. This is work we did in the Jemez, looking at the history of some of the older shrub fields. And we can see that we basically just increased the part of the landscape that's now susceptible to turning into them. This was a picture from a century ago in upper Santa Clara Canyon. I had a bunch of old repeat photographs I could have shown, but there was no time. But here's one Ellis retook. He was sampling tree rings in there. And you know, that went from dense conifer. Santa Clara has really suffered from the combination of Cerro Grande and Las Conchas fire. In that watershed, it hurts them emotionally. Not just directly and materially and hydrologically. But this is the outcome we probably don't want. And of course, as we all know, when you burn the tree cover off these places, they behave different hydrologically. And this is stuff after, those were Cerro Grande, this is after Las Conchas, this is after the Lakes fire. This is flooding in Frijoles Canyon, just a mile or 2 upstream from the visitor center. Extraordinary floods. There's the delta at the mouth of Frijoles Canyon that actually briefly blocked the Rio Grande. Sediment coming from those big flood events that came out of there. So anyway, to close, the history of these things gives us a sense of the historic range of variability. What's going on now are natural responses to changing environmental drivers, some of them human land use decisions and how we manage landscapes, and some of them are things like we're doing to big drivers like climate, which fire and vegetation growth responds to. And what we're seeing are these tipping point surprises, these thresholds. And they're surprised, some of them are surprises because we haven't seen them in the historical record of hundreds of years. Anyway, for the last 30 years, people like me have been trying to use these records of the past to develop a historical range of variability and saying, well, land managers, we should try to manage to keep our forests inside that range of variability for the last 400 years, where we can see that fire used to burn, but it wasn't killing all the forest. But we're almost beyond that now. We're starting to be subject to things outside that historic range of variability, and we're going to have to anticipate and begin managing for this future range of variability, which we don't know what it is yet. And so this is what we're trying to do now. We're kind of scrambling a little bit. But in any case, there's a lot of learning by society to do moving forward, involving scientists, land managers, and public. History is no less important to us. It still helps us define what the range of possibilities are. But there are surprises where we're having to learn new things. Regardless of the risks and uncertainties, we do know enough that we can manage forests to be different. They don't have to, they looked like this once, they've turned it to things like this, they're going to things like this. We can help them at least buy time for them to go back to things like this. And so while there's risks, and a lot of times these talks get a little gloomy sometimes because it's like, ooh, there's some bad trends out there, and it's just, that is the news, but we need to report that we're seeing and documenting. But there are opportunities and options, there's hopeful things, but we're going to need to do these things. We got to act with some urgency. We need to do it collaboratively. We're all in this together. A little bit of a challenge societally these days, but I think we'll get back there. We've got to continue to learn, and there's going to continue to be surprises. And anyway, but the Jemez remains beautiful. And so, anyway, that's it.
Linda, I don't know where you went, but I know you said you had questions. Do we have any questions?
If the mother trees are dying, are you stockpiling seed to take advantage of the presence of trees that you have in existence now in anticipation of future fires?
Indeed, and actually even starting to do some testing to maybe select for more drought-tolerant genotypes of these trees, or selecting some of the trees from lower elevations, starting to move. This is one of the big questions foresters are facing, and ecologists, both. That it's like, well, wait a minute, you're telling us that in 30 years, we're already seeing forests being stressed, and in 30 years, these forests aren't going to continue to be in the same place where they are today. And I mean, there's a whole lot more that could be said about that. This turns out New Mexico, in part because of these historic reasons, and a couple of colleagues were at the lab here and at UNM, this has been one of the, Pinyon and juniper, this one-seed juniper and Pinus edulis, this Pinyon are two of the three most studied tree species on the planet in terms of their response to drought stress. And so and there are some reasons to be concerned moving forward. But anyway, yes, the answer is yes, that there's a working, and there's a project, and I should mention, actually, one of the hopeful things that's going on is there is an effort called the East Jemez Landscapes Future that one of the guys working in our group, he's now with Nature Conservancy, but Colin Haffey and Jeremy Sweat, the Chief of Resource Management at Bandolier. In the last 2 years, they've been organizing, working with folks at NAU, but working across this east flank of the Jemez and basically trying to address the question of this landscape has changed a lot and it's not going to go back to what it was in large places. And we have a lot of uncertainties. And so sort of assessing the interest from Cochiti up to Santa Clara, and they've been involving people certainly from the Los Alamos community and laboratory and Forest Service and each of the local pueblos and the Caldera. Trying to answer some of those questions, and one of their efforts is actually looking at tree seed sources on different places and trying to stockpile them. And there's a guy with New Mexico State Forestry extension outreach, there's a little, they have a little forestry nursery operation at Mora where they can grow, propagate trees. And so we're collecting seeds here in the Jemez, and he's growing them out, and we're going to be testing them in different places on the landscape. So yeah. Other questions? Check.
One an observation and then one a question. Pardon me for the people who replanted the trees around Los Alamos did too good a job. And those trees may become our enemies because they're much too dense. Is there any discussion about that?
I haven't heard it, and I haven't been central to this East Jemez Landscapes future conversation yet, but I would encourage you to raise that question, Chick.
Yeah, they did a really good job.
And
Unfortunately.
yeah, I was out there.
You mentioned about buying time, and I think as you showed, something like 1/4 of all our coniferous forests in Arizona and New Mexico are burned. If you plot that into the future, you can see that in about 50 years, the Native Plant Society may take people on a tour to go see a grove of ponderosas, you know, the last one in this part of the state. And it makes no sense to say, well, the forests are unhealthy, because right now, we're just burning them all down. And instead of being able to buy time, the forests are just going to burn down. And I can't get anybody to discuss the 500-pound elephant in the room, which is, why don't we modernize forest fire suppression? Once you can put them out, you can make decisions. You can let them burn, let this happen, burn this. But everybody just takes it as God said, you can't put them out. Everyone knows you can, and you can do it at night with airplanes, but no one will consider it. And I just have never been able to figure why people won't even talk about modernizing it. We just pay $2 billion for guys to go around and evacuate towns. They don't have any effect on the fire.
Well, I tend to agree with you, Chick. I mean, you know, it would be very expensive to do. I mean, you've been floating some of these proposals for 17 years now,
at least. Is it any more expensive than what just happened in California?
A good question. And I may have told you this. I think I did when I saw you recently, not long ago. But if it makes you feel any better, although it may not, there was a National Academy of Sciences workshop on wildfire in North America last March in DC, and I gave a little talk about these kind of nonlinear responses. And then they had presentations in the morning. In the afternoon, they had these breakout groups. And I moved to 2 of them, and I hit them with this idea. I said, look, because they were looking for ideas and new things. I have no idea whether it'll go anywhere. But I would say that it isn't all going to burn up, though, because there's a self-limiting component to the fuel. All right, the kinds of fires, when they become surface fires again, we could defend Los Alamos from Las Conchas because the fuels have been reset by Cerro Grande, right? And so, right, the town, I mean, we functioned here with the fire burning there for quite some time, right, without it being such a great risk. And so, and the fuels aren't growing back as fast as they did before because the climate's a bit different.
But once you don't have any forests, there's no problem with the fire.
Well, right, but so the point is, but even before you get to that point, and there's been a lot of, I mean, you can see it happening here on the east flank. I mean, it was actually why when the Dome Fire happened and the Forest Service wanted to drop bulldozers into the Bandolier Wilderness to stick a fire line on the east side of the Dome Fire because the lab is pressing them to do this, okay? And they said, no, you don't need to do that because the La Mesa fire reset the fuels in front of this thing, and you could go in there, as people then did, with drip torches and burn off of the trails and create a big black line. Okay, that wasn't where the risk was. The risk was through, the area that it burned subsequently, okay, where the fuels haven't been reset. So anyway, we won't lose all of the forest through fire, but the bigger existential risk at the scale of decades through this century is what warming will do. Okay, I mean, it's the warming and the drought stress not during the good wet years, but during the dry years. It'll start pushing things over the edge. And we already see on the lower edges of their distributions, just like the 50s drought. It was on the driest lower edges of the Ponderosa Pine Zone and on the driest sites where the Pinyon were growing that they died. Okay, and that lower fringe of the ponderosa pine zone has been continuing to retreat since 2000, okay, in the episodic pulses. Okay, now there's still terrain above. Ponderosa grows pretty far up elevation. I don't think they're all going to die in the next 50 years. But 4 degrees C is too much. I'm sorry. But I mean, by the end of the century. I don't know where those thresholds are. I work with people all over the planet trying to help them do empirical models and process-based models, and we're trying to get the remote sensing at a global scale to basically be able to see, let the forest tell us what's too much stress. That's another thing that should be worth some investment for as much as forests are worth to us on this planet. So we don't know how much stress, nobody does yet at this point. So even if the climate change projection models were absolutely dead on, okay, in terms of what would happen under different scenarios of fossil fuel emissions, even if we had perfect knowledge of the future climate, there's not a single vegetation response model that I believe moving forward, because modeling tree mortality turns out is super complicated and is very hard to do. But I can just tell you 4 degrees is too much, because that's the difference between glacial and interglacial, in which we know everything at equilibrium moves thousands of feet. And so that's why they'll be taking the tour to those last little wet refuges up high of the ponderosa pine stand someday.
One more question. Ready?
At the beginning of your presentation, you showed different countries where you were working with people. Are there any other areas that are studied as intensely as this is in some of those other countries?
At the scale of the whole mountain range? That's a good question. I mean, there's certainly numerous small research sites where, sort of LTER research sites. Some of them are pretty big, like the Sevieta. But the diversity and intensity of stuff that's gone on in the Jemez in the last 30 years, there's a lot, actually. But I will say, in terms of like this fire history, this is the largest, even before Ellis filled in all the dots in his hexagonal gridding of the mountain range, this was the largest landscape scale tree ring based fire history on the planet, even at this point. I mean, there's been work like that done all over the place, but not a 1 million acre mountain range where we've gotten this much. So no, it's been a productive landscape to work in for a while, and there's been a lot of people, not many of us.
All right, well, the tree rings are up here, so if you want to come and talk to Craig about them and look at them, they are available. We also have some outdoors books, and including, if you have not seen it yet, Terry Fox's wonderful story, Forest in the Fire. The Historical Society did send a couple of boxes of that to a bookstore in California that is giving them away to children there, and we are just really privileged to be able to do that as an organization to help kids get through these horrible forest fires that are affecting them. So it's a great book, and if you haven't gotten it for a kid in your life, I highly recommend it. Thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating.